Okay, you've got it running. Now can we trade places?
Yeah, it's
Oh,
working.
by all means.
Okay.
Did you want me to stop it first?
No, just leave it
Well,
going.
she punched it right and it started just like that.
Well, fine, you can do it and I can't. Good evening. My name is Charles Hirschman Jr. and today is June 24th, 1993. And we're at our home in Seattle, Washington, and I'm going to talk with my father, Charles Hirschman Sr., who's here visiting us this evening. And the purpose of this discussion is to ask my father about his life and experiences. And the first question I want to ask him is about where he was born, when he was born, and about his family.
Well, Charles, I tell you, my father just traveled, that was all. My mother's father was a traveling salesman, and my mother lived, and her mother lived in Kansas City, and I don't know how my father met my mother's father, but he did, and he brought my father home to marry my mother, and they got married. And it's
Do you know what year that was in?
1909, and for some reason they moved and lived in Mansfield, Louisiana. My father was a watchmaker. That was his father apprenticed him out as a watchmaker, and as a result he was always able to make a living anywhere and everywhere as a watchmaker and a jewelry. And he opened a little jewelry store down there. And I want to tell you a part of something that my mother told us that I didn't believe, but evidently. When you lived in the South in those days, and of course it was before washing machines and everything else, there, back of the house, there was a great big shed. My mother said that she went around with keys around her waist, and what happened is that you changed your linens once a week, and you didn't wash them because that was the way they lived. And you put all of these linens back in a shed that was in the back. And twice a year they washed them.
Twice a year.
This had this whole, it was all full of linens, so they had a heck of a lot. The other thing is that they had, and these whole set of keys, is that they bought their, with the word perishable, they bought them by the barrel. They bought barrels of flour. They bought barrels of beans. And as they needed them, and they carried the keys, they would give the keys, they all had black help. They gave the keys to the container, and they would go out, and they'd bring it in the way they cooked. Now, that's as much as I can tell you about the way that my family lived. This was before I was born. After they were married and they lived there, and don't ask me because all of this whole part is a blank, they moved to Parkers, West Virginia.
But let me ask you first, do you know when they moved from Kansas City to Mansfield, Louisiana?
It must have been 1909, because I was born in 1911. Coleman was born in Mansfield, Louisiana. Don't forget there was only 18 months difference between us.
So
He was born in January of 1910, and I was born in July of 1911. They were 18 months apart.
July 25th, 1911.
Yeah.
And then where was Uncle Harry and Aunt Babette? Where were they born? And when were
Harry
they born?
and Babette were both born in Huntington, West Virginia. They moved there. But I don't, there's such blanks on these things here. But anyway, they moved to Parkers, West Virginia. Now, this is an impression and really not a memory. We were living in some kind of a building, and I have a recollection, and that's all, of standing on a balcony and watching the water run down. And it was the flood of 1913.
So you were 2 years old.
That's right. As I say,
And this was in Parkersburg?
this is in Parkersburg, West Virginia. I don't have any idea of when we moved to Huntington, West Virginia. By the way, the reason that we were in Parkersburg is because my maternal grandfather had a shoe store there. And I don't know, my father, I don't think he was in dry goods at all at that time. He moved to Huntington, and the reason, now this I do know, he moved to Huntington because his brother, Isaac Hirschman, had a clothing store in Ashland, Kentucky, which was around about 20, 25 miles south of Huntington. And he must have told my father, Max, you come on down and I'm going to supply you and you can pay me back as you sell the merchandise. So my father opened a store. And this store was at the corner of 3rd Avenue and 7th Street, which was directly across the farmer's market. Now,
Huntington.
you have to remember in those days, again, everything, that things are vastly different. The farmer's market on every Saturday, on either they came in from miles, and you bought your food for the week. That was everything. This was maybe the best location in the city for what my father had. But he was a very, very successful merchant. The store grew and he paid back his Uncle Ike and he did a heck of a business. And I've forgotten where we lived, but my father was a kind of a progressive guy. And first of all, we had a maid, and the maid came over from Belgium, I believe, and she was crazy about circuses. So we went to circus every time it came to town. And our first car that we had was a Saxon. And in those days, you paid cash for the car you got. Nobody knew anything about buying them. Time play was there.
How old were you when you got this car, do you know?
Charles, it was before I went to... It's working now, I see the light.
Okay, we're back on camera and we're ready to begin again. Our battery wore down a moment ago. So you were telling me about your father's car.
Yeah. We got this Saxon. And in those days, of course, they didn't have roads like we know them now. But the great, great big deal that anybody who had an automobile, in the evening you got in that automobile and you took a ride. That was as big a deal as a space travel today. Anyway, that's fine, and that I pretty well remember. I went to school first in Buffington School.
Buffington, that's the name of it?
Buffington Elementary School, yeah, and I forgot where that was now. But of course, that's been closed for a long time, because I certainly went to school in 1917.
Do you know, did you walk to school?
Always walked. Who ever heard of a school bus in those days? They didn't exist. Rain, shine, or anything else. The only other thing I remember also, and this is again one of those hazy ones. My mother and Coleman and I were in a darkened room. We all had flu at exactly the same time. That flu epidemic was 1917, 1918.
Right. Influenza epidemic.
And I guess that we must have been pretty sick, but we all survived and we didn't have any problems with that at all. I can remember Armistice Day because they exploded, it sounded like bombs, but of course it was firecrackers. But firecrackers went off every place like that, and everybody was out in the street yelling. And you might know that this was a false armistice. This was the day before. Oh, there was a false armistice.
No, I didn't know that.
Oh yes, I think it was in 1910 that they announced that the war was over.
1908. This was November 11th, 1918. That's
Yeah.
when the Armistice Day was.
Yeah, it was in 1918. But that was a false armistice. Then there was another armistice, and of course, 1911. But that time it was an anti-climax. Of course, school, I don't remember a great deal about school. That's just one of those things. You've got the report cards at home. Well, it's that time.
What do you remember about your father's family, the Hirschmans? Did you know anybody else in the family besides your father?
Now, I think you heard this story because I had a very vivid imagination. And I kept telling everybody I had a lion. And one of my father's sisters was Aunt Rhea, that's all I know. Charles, I don't remember her at all. I don't remember at all. But she gave me a lion, and this lion was big enough for me to climb on its back. And it had a ring at the neck, and you pulled the ring out, and as it went back in, the lion roared. And it was on wheels. It could be pushed around and so forth. That Uncle Ike, I knew from Ashland, Kentucky. We had kind of a close relationship because we saw him maybe once every 2 or 3 months. And he had 2 children. I've forgotten their names even now, but the boy, I don't know what happened to him, but the girl, and this is quite a story, now we're jumping years ahead, she got engaged, she got married, and there was a great big dinner in the evening after the wedding, and everybody was there, and just as President Bush collapsed at the father, Uncle Isaac, collapsed at the table. It was a heart attack, and he died the following morning.
This was in the 1920s sometime?
Yeah, I can't even remember her name anymore, but she was considerably older. She was older than Coleman, so this must have been in the late 20s.
Was Uncle Isaac older than your father?
Yes, he was the old. Yeah, he was older than my father, and he died. Now that part I will remember. See, I'm doing a lot of jumping. This must have been in the early 30s. By the way, I do have to say something. You don't have children today. They can ask a 10-year-old about world problems and everything, but when I was young, we didn't do that. There was no such thing as that. We were children, and we played mumbly peg, and we played statue. And by the way, the girls played with us exactly the same way. It was a neighborhood group because we never had any of these things that you got today to keep kids out of trouble. Because in those days, we lived very close together and everything. So I didn't pay any attention, and nobody paid a great deal of attention to national or international affairs at that particular time. The Teapot Dome scandal was on, and who knew anything about that? But President Harding, we now think, committed suicide. And that particular time, that we were old enough, that Coleman was at a Boy Scout camp, and your Uncle Coleman Hirschman is perhaps the only Boy Scout in I don't know where who lowered the flag at half-mast because they passed it, you took turns raising and lowering the flag. He lowered the flag at half-mast when Harding died. So that was quite something too. Coleman was a very, very steady guy, and that was one of the things that I wasn't. And I think I've told you that Coleman was a 90, 95 grade, and by the way, we had grades in those days, scholar. And when I went there, I was very erratic, and as I've mentioned to you before, the teachers would look at me and say, "Charles, are you really Coleman's brother?" But that's one of those things. Peerless, Margaret Peerless. We had she was from Dayton, and she was part of Mother's family, and I'll tell you, I can go into those a little bit later when we go into Dayton. But in Dayton, Ohio, the Schwartzes and the Peerlesses and the Kussworms were all related, and they were the cream of the Jewish society and the Jewish families, and they just were everything. Margaret Peerless came to visit us. Now, you saw our house in Huntington. You were down there. In that house in Huntington, we had a room that must have been 14 feet wide, and it must have been 22, 23 feet long. It was a great big room. There was a concert grand piano at one end of that room, and the rest of it was open. The reason I remember Margaret Peerless is because there's a chandelier in the middle of the room, and she was having these boys, social affairs, and they were coming in and everything. And one of these was a dummy, see? And he wanted to show off to say what a wonderful person he was, and he picked me up and he lifted me over his head, and I hit that chandelier, and boing! That's how I remember Margaret Peerless.
Was this in Huntington or in
Yeah,
Dayton?
this is Huntington,
Huntington.
and this was in the mid to the late 20s, because by that time I must have been 10, 12 years old. Peerless, now, she's dead. I can digress, because a lot of the stories, one ties into the other. Penny's, is that this great big department store that's around? I can't think of the store now.
Probably.
I know, I'll look at it. Anyway, And also, as we're going, you don't forget the Prohibition had already come
Right.
in. The Volstead Act, I think, went into effect in 1918. Of course, liquor was just as available then as it was later, and the doctors and the druggists made a fortune because you could always prescribe medicinal.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh yes, no problem at all. Also, somehow or another, there was a wine that was put out that had a sufficient amount of alcoholic content. It was Virginia Dare. This is all. It was a very popular drink. I didn't start drinking at that time. I worked in my father's store. About 1927 or 28, must have been 1927, maybe. Anyway, my father went to what's the name of that medical institute in,
Mayo Clinic?
what?
The Mayo Clinic?
The Mayo Clinic, yeah. And he went up there and he had an operation and took the goiter out. In those days, it was a pretty rough operation. And I went with him. The reason I went with him is because, again, I was the harebrained one. Don't forget, Coleman was a solid, steady one. And Coleman took care of the store.
Oh, I see.
This time, don't forget now, I was, if that was 1928, I was, what, 17 years old.
Right. So how did you go to Minnesota? How did you go to Minnesota? By train?
Yeah, oh, sure. That's the only way you could, no airplanes in those days.
Right.
Yeah. So, and when he came back to Huntington afterwards, he developed paranoia, and he thought that my mother was running around and everything else. It was a very, very, very unpleasant experience. And I must tell you, and again, we're going to have to jump on this from time in time. He lost the store, lost all his business, everything went to hell in the basket. We lost that house that you saw. And now that I can tell you definitely, in 1929, we moved to Dayton. And in moving to Dayton, this is one of those crazy, crazy things where my mother was at the peak of the social strata, but we were at the bottom of the economic strata, which is a very crazy thing.
Is this because her family was from Dayton?
Yeah, they were all there, see, they were all there. And that is where Coleman went to work at the West Side Furniture Company. Lester Kussworm owned the West Side, and he took over.
Mm-hmm.
And Coleman worked in the office, and I worked on the truck.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that you were about 18 years old then.
I was 18, 1929, yeah. And I must have worked for a year or so. Coleman, I think that Lester, then, I went, as a helper on a truck, and I think he gave me a salary of $25 a week so that Coleman could go to college. So Coleman went to the college, went to the Ohio State University,
In Columbus.
and it was a subsistence thing, and to be able to go, he was the major domo, I guess, of a fraternity house, which meant, I suppose, the room and board was free. I don't know, but I know that it was very uncomfortable for Coleman because afterwards he wasn't interested in any of his fraternity brothers.
Mm-hmm.
But Sigma Alpha Mu was the fraternity. I dated one girl every Saturday night, and I think I've told you about this. We went to the picture show. Don't forget picture show. The downtown picture show was the high price show. That was 25 cents. And the streetcar fare was a nickel.
Mm-hmm.
So for 60 cents, actually for a dollar bill,
Mm-hmm.
I could pick her up, get on the streetcar, take her down, go to a picture show, stop off and have an ice cream soda. They were 10 or 15 cents, I forgot what it was, and take her home. I dated that girl for Connie Eisenberger was her name. About this time I met a fellow by the name of Bud Witt. Bud Witt was a rabbi's son, and somehow or another we went together pretty good, and that's when I began seeing if I couldn't drink the place dry. I was working for a insurance uh, agent. And what he had was a route. And you would have to go, you'd have to go to these stalls and you would pick up $1 here and $5 there and $3 there, and that's the way they had their insurance.
This is sort of a premium on an insurance
Yeah,
policy?
the premium on the insurance policy. And you have the little book and you turn the money in and so forth. The temple had dances every once so often, and now this is where we go. They had dances every once and so often, and one night out of a clear blue sky, and now I think I should do a lot of regressing, but I'm not going to for the moment. The boy's name was Irv Hollander, and some people have fetishes, and his was nurses. Nurses to him were the most wonderful people on earth, and anyway, he said, would you like to meet a couple of nurses? And this was in the middle of a dance. And I said, why not? What the heck, I didn't care. So he didn't call. And we went out, and there was Gertrude Malee and Catherine and Dan Loney. And that's when I met your mother.
This must be in 1936?
1936, yeah. I'm doing a hell of a lot. I tell you, and this, between 1929 and 1936, Charles, I did an awful lot of running around. I did an awful lot of drinking. I did an awful lot of everything. And it must have been not 36, it must have been 1935, because this was, our marriage finally at the end was something else again. And I wish I could remember, I can't. Your mother won me in a beauty contest or something like that. It was a big joke. We played Monopoly. That's what we played that night. And I asked your mother to date, and we dated for a while. After a while, it began to get kind of serious. And it got a little too serious for both of us. She was a very, very devout Catholic. And while I was not much of a Jew, I don't think, since the time I was confirmed, when I was, 15 or 16 years old, till then, I don't think I've been in temple a dozen times. But I think I've mentioned to you that I think I was a historical Jew, not a religious Jew.
Did you have a bar mitzvah?
Yeah. They were confirmed. Remember I told you, they made everything in English. Mm-hmm. The Jews wanted to become assimilated into the country. The services had very little Hebrew, and there was no bar mitzvah. It was a confirmation.
Oh.
That's what it was. And we declared a moratorium. And I didn't see or contact your mother, and this was for 30 days. And at the end of 30 days, I called her, and that was it. And there was no question about what was going to happen. Catherine was not in favor of it. Her father, who was a very, very, very nice man, just said to her that she should know that she was getting into something that undoubtedly was going to cause her a lot of trouble and a lot of heartache. But your mother was kind of bullheaded. Mm-hmm. Incidentally, she was the industrial nurse at the Omer Fair Register. And you've seen her pictures. She's quite a dish. Mm-hmm. And the boys always had complaints to come in. And there was one guy who bothered the hell out of her. In fact, I don't know whether you still got it or not. There was a suitcase, a fitted case that she got that had MGM on it, and this guy gave it to her for Christmas. Anyway, between the Jewish community and the Catholic and the family and everything else, went to Atlanta, Georgia. And they got married down there. I'd like to go back a little bit because the 30s were something. Before I went to work for Charlie Goldswig, and that was the guy's name.
Now, who were you, what job was this?
Charlie Goldswig was the insurance agent.
Oh, the insurance
Yeah.
agent.
Before that, I worked for the Intross Shoe Company. And I think I've told you about this before, but I can't. And by the way, then Coleman had to leave school, and Coleman went back to work for the West Side Furniture Company, and he was in the office. He wasn't the office manager.
Was this because of the depression that he had to drop out of school?
Yeah, yeah. And I guess Lester Cuthbert. Oh, by the way, one of the reasons also is I got fired. The only job I ever got fired from in my whole life, and the reason is that the driver of the truck liked to play the horses. And he had me go in and place a 50-cent bet, because in those days they did it on a horse. And as I was coming out of the bookies, Lester Cuthbert drove by and saw me. And I was, when you were fired, you were fired. Those days, the boss was lord and master. So then I went to work for the Intrust Shoe Company. I started out at $12 a week. And we got to work at 8 o'clock in the morning and supposed to have quit at 6 o'clock in the evening. The post office those days was closed at 7 o'clock in the evening. And this was the home office of the chain of shoe stores. And what they had to do was, one store would be out of a size of another store would have the size, and they would switch them back and forth. The warehouse, or let me say, when they bought shoes in those days, they would buy, and now my figures may or may not be right, but they would buy 10,000 pair of shoes, and they would allocate this one number. They would allocate them to the 16 stores, and then they would have a reserve supply in the warehouse, and that's where I was.
This is all in Dayton.
All in Dayton. All in Dayton. And what I had to do was I would get requisitions during the week for the sizes that were on special order for a customer or that they were out of, and we would package them up and mail them parcel post, because parcel post was very cheap. But Monday night, we began at 7 o'clock on Monday night, and there was a board, and the board was like this, and each board had about 10 or 15 strips of paper, and these strips of paper had the number of the shoe and the sizes that were here, and then they had A, B, C, D, and triple E. And we switched all night. We never left before midnight. We switched shoes from one store to another, and we would send the requisition, the orders out, and then during the week, then they would be fill-ins from the warehouse where I was at. And at long last, I got a raise to $14 a week for this. By the way, I had 2 assistants working with me. Now, this sounds stupid today. I didn't know anything about people who were black, green, blue, or pink, or anything else. And one of the boys was a real nice black fella, and the other one was a Jewish boy who was a couple of years younger than me. And the 3 of us worked together. I never knew the guy was anything except one of the guys. It's just one of those dumb, crazy things that all of this racism. I think I told you, when we were in Huntington, West Virginia, that across the street from us there was a black family, and they had the cleanest house, the best lawn, the best painted house of anybody in the neighborhood. I didn't know that there was any. Well, anyway, that's the way I was raised. So we went down to Atlanta, Georgia. By the way, is there any questions now that, because I've been doing a lot of talking and I've been jumping all over the place.
Well, there are some questions that I wanted to ask, but I think you've covered a lot of it already. But some of the questions I wanted to ask was about your mother's family and your father's family. Now, for instance, I knew that your father's family lived in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
That's when we went down and saw the records in the 19th century. They lived there. When you were growing up, were your father's family still in Cincinnati? Were they gone other places?
Well, wait a minute. When I was growing up, all the Cincinnatians were dead except Uncle Abe. And Uncle Abe, and this is a story that they tell me, and I guess it's true enough. Uncle Abe bought merchandise, and he left it in the cartons, and He left it on the floor of his store. Sometimes he had them stacked up, and he sat at the front door smoking a cigarette. He was a great, big, heavy guy. And when somebody, and he had a lot of customers. When people would come in and they would ask for something, he would say, well, you're going to find them over there in that box, over there. You go over and get it what you want and let me know. And as the guy went out the door, he paid him. Now, there's a remarkable story to this whole thing. Out of a clear blue sky, he hired a real, honest-to-God go-getter. And the go-getter didn't, I don't think, had any money. But he really knew merchandising, and there is a Hirschman's. There was a Hirschman's in Cincinnati that was an enormous, great, big discount store. It was as big as Walmart's are a much, much bigger store than the Kmart. But it was as big as the Kmart that's in Durham today. It was a big store. And we walked in there, and they had a barber shop in there. They had, now these were listed, and a shoe shop, but these were off on the side, like this. And the main store, they had everything. They had hardware, they had sporting goods, they had everything. They might be there. When Uncle Abe died, he gave the store lock, stock, and barrel to that fellow, because that was it. In the meantime, he must have lived like a lord.
But now, did you know, you only discovered this later when you went to Cincinnati and saw the store?
No, I had met Uncle Abe. I'd met him. And
when you were growing up?
Yeah. Oh. See, let me tell you one other episode. My Dewey was my grandmother. My mother's mother.
Right.
My mother's father and mother were still alive. Both of them are buried in Huntington, West Virginia right now. Adolph Schwartz and Doris Schwartz. I have, since we've been there, I've been back to the cemetery. Anyway, somewhere along the line, she became a Christian Scientist. And I'm not exactly sure about the tenets of Christian Science, but something about them that you don't take medicine, and by praying you can cure your body and so forth. And she who was such a very, very sweet grandmother, and crazy about her, everything about her was wonderful and dandy, she began having a hell of a temper and having awful mean and everything like that. Finally, she got so sick that she had to see a doctor. And she went to a doctor in Huntington. And it was immediately diagnosed as cancer. And for some reason, instead of staying in Huntington, my mother took her to Cincinnati to see, because there were Jews in Cincinnati, a great big, maybe they would do that. Went to Cincinnati, and she died in 2 weeks. I mean, from the time that they found out that she had cancer until she died was not more than 3 or 4 weeks. She was able to stand all the pain and all the trouble and all the everything. And she must have died somewhere between 1926 or 1928 or 29.
This is why you were still living in Hamilton.
Yeah. And she was buried from our house. The funeral service was in our house. Remember that. Dolphy, we called him Dolphy and Dewey. Dolphy lived with us until he died. And during that period, he bought us a pony, believe it or not. One of the very famous horses or ponies in the entire world was called Dan Patch. And he brought the pony home and said it was Dan Patch was the name of the pony. It was a beautiful pony, I think. Anyway, we rode that poor beast to death. In the first place, we were not more than 3 blocks from the mountains. If you will recall, when we were there, you saw the house, that Ritter Park was there, and then it went up.
Mm.
Well, we rode that pony up and down those hills.
Now, did your grandfather Dolph, did he move with you to Dayton?
He moved? No.
He
no.
died.
He died before we went to Dayton. Oh, before I forget, about my father, that is, the divorce and separation, we went up there. He followed my mother to Dayton. He opened a little bitty dry goods store way, way away from us. But Charles, I have no idea how long, but it was months and months and months that he would come to our house every evening and we would play bridge. And I don't know whether you can imagine this or not, but I got to the point where I could memorize every card in the deck that had been played. Now don't forget, this was auction bridge, and I don't know anything about it today because everything is different. But I think I was a halfway decent bridge player in those days. But the fact that they became very, very good friends, and I want you to know that my mother went to New Orleans, to my knowledge, twice, and lived with him. It's visited and lived with him.
This was in the 40s.
Yeah, oh yes, this was in the 40s, sure.
But now this was in
Wait a
the...
minute, just a second. I don't want to be too fast about that. No, oh, no. This is between 1930 and 1935 to 36 that this happened.
But you went, you moved to
Wait,
Dayton.
it must have been in the 40s because he died in 47 or 48, I'm not sure which. So it must have been in the 40s when she went down, because we must have, the reason I'm what shall I say, balled up, is we were living in Atlanta, and Mother was living in Indianapolis with Coleman. So that's how I got balled up on that. Anyway, they found by the way, he opened a little jewelry store and a watch repair shop in Washington, in New Orleans. That's how he got along. Mm-hmm. Never was always making a living. Let me tell you, I wanted Mike to learn cobbling. He had an opportunity to work for $5 a week and learn shoe repair. Because I know that if you can learn to repair shoes, there ain't no way you can fail to make a living no matter what happened. Mike wouldn't have any part of it. So, that. But anyway, down there, he was all alone. And he died, and they didn't know it for 2 days. Mm-hmm. And he is buried in the Veterans Cemetery down there. And Coleman and Jane have seen his grave.
In New Orleans?
I think it's Baton Rouge, or it's Baton Rouge or New Orleans, I don't know which, but he's buried in the Veterans Cemetery that's down there. Mm-hmm. There. See, talking to me is bad because I jump here and there.
Well, that's all right.
Yeah.
That's good. Now, you said that your mother's met your father in Kansas City.
Yeah.
So the Schwartzes were living then in Kansas City, and now they went to Parkersburg. Do you know anything about when they went?
But I can tell you something else. I have told you that my maternal, because I have to keep this separate, my maternal grandfather was a drummer. He went on the road and he was selling shoes, and that's why he had
This is Adolph Schwartz.
Yeah, that was Adolph Schwartz, and he had shoes. And when he went, they went by train. And when he went to the city, he rented a horse and buggy. Mm-hmm. And he loaded, these were cases of shoes. These cases of shoes were loaded on the buggy. It had to be like a freight buggy, that was it. And then he would spend all the time going through there and showing the shoes to the various stores and so forth. So that when he went on the road, he went on the road for months and months and months. I don't know whether it was Adolph Schwartz's family, and I don't know whether it was Dora Goodman's family, who was my grandmother. But every time he went on the road, he was gone for months. So that my maternal grandmother would pick up my mother and brother, she had a brother, you know that.
What was his name?
Charles,
And then, never mind.
I can't think of it right now, but anyway, I can tell you something about that brother later on. But anyway, they went to Chicago, and they would stay in Chicago until he was ready to come home, and evidently, like a lot when he came home, he stayed for a couple of months. Then they went back to Kansas City. Now, as I don't know, I have no idea how they went from Kansas City to Mansfield, Louisiana. They probably went to Mansfield, Louisiana to Parkersburg because my mother's father said something about them going to work for him, and they should settle down and so forth and so forth. I do know why they went to Huntington and how they got to Huntington. But,
Do you know, so your maternal grandparents
yeah.
came to live with you in Huntington,
Yeah, they both came to live with me in Huntington, that's right.
and then they both died when you were living in Huntington, and
They both died.
and they're buried there in
Yeah,
the cemetery.
they're both buried there, yeah.
Now, why did your mother move to Dayton in 1929? Was that because her relatives were there?
Yeah, because her relative. That was the only place in the world she could move.
Was it her brothers and sisters, or who was?
No, it was her cousins and her uncles and so forth. Did you ever meet Corinne Kussworm?
No.
Corinne Kussworm was probably the ugliest woman I ever saw in my life. She was great, big, and fat, and she was terrible. She was a terrible person. And Lester Kussworm is about this. Oh, by the way, Corinne Kussworm was my mother's first cousin.
Oh, I see.
Lester Kussworm was about so big, dripping wet. Corinne towered over him by at least a foot. But he was crazy about her. I don't ask me how, and I don't know why or anything. But he married her. But Corinne Kussworm's father, and I suppose, I don't know what her mate was a guy who had been a sailor all of his life, and he called Lester Kussworm Goosey, believe it or not, Goosey. And Lester Kussworm kept this guy alive and took care of him all of his life. He moved there, Lester bought him a house, and in front of the house, this guy here put a great big anchor in the living room, or in the front yard.
Mm-hmm.
Every time a sailor came to town, he would stop and help. Incidentally, he was living again with a relative. Now I'm talking about sailor.
Mm-hmm.
And they lived together. They weren't married, and there was nothing because they were quite elderly. But they were that was Corinne's parents, and probably maybe it was Dolphy's brother. I don't know. I have no idea. But everybody was a relative. The Peerlesses were the relative. The Kussworms were the relative. They were all relatives, and I'm just telling you, they were all high society in that particular case. So there was no place else in the world for my mother to go.
Mm-hmm.
It just was not.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we got there. I think this is enough, don't you?
Yeah, I think we've had enough for tonight. Let me
Yeah.
see if I can turn this on.
Yeah. Haven't turned it off yet, I can tell.
Let's see if I can turn it on up here.